This podcast was sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be tuning in. We welcome you to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast here on Zoom. And this is our COVID-19 edition, take 5, if I'm counting right. Take 5, since we've been in lockdown over the last little while. So we're glad you're back with us. We have a great podcast and show for you today with a very special guest that we're going to introduce here in just a minute. We want to say thank you and hello to our sponsor, as always, our good friends at A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Dave Mullen and his staff there and supporting us and what we do here on the podcast for a while, and we're appreciative of that. Once again, my name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the priest and rector over at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London.
And I'm his partner in crime, Kevin George, the rector of St. Aidan's Anglican Church in the Northwest. And I'm looking across the producer there.
I'm Ian. I produce. I edit. I mostly edit this thing. Yeah, the creative genius is Kevin. He opened a website. I had no idea about that. Anyway.
Yeah, Kevin kind of went rogue and took over your role and put up a new website for us. So, what's the website, Kevin? If people want.
So yeah, folks, if you go take a look, it's thevickerscrossing.com, and you'll see our bios on there. And what's really cool now is we've been able to add with these episodes all the videos of our COVID Zoom rooms and the. As well as the links to our iTunes accounts and so on. And there's a whole host of our upcoming guests. You'll be able to see that next week. We're going to speak with Sarah Miles and with also with Jamie Smith, another Canadian. And the week after that, we have a great new young writer in Emily Scott from the St. Lydia Project coming on to speak with us as well. So take a look at the webpage, folks, thevickerscrossing.com.
And we are so happy today, to invite into the Zoom room here at the Vickers Crossing author, speaker, scholar, Diana Butler Bass joining us. Hi, Diana.
Hey, guys. What a lineup that is. I want to watch every one of those Zoom casts.
Yeah.
That'd be great, yeah. And well, we're so thrilled that we could touch base with you. You've been a very formative part, I think, of all of our ministries. I was down looking at my library, remembering books like this.
Yeah,
it's very formative. And this, I did a book study on a church in my former parish.
And this,
and that one is the latest ones, yeah. And so, Diana, really been enjoying your work and your writing over the years. So we're just thrilled to have you here. Welcome to the Vickers Crossing.
Well, thank you for having me. When my mom was alive, she died a few years ago. I had written 8 books before she died, and she said to me one time, "You know, Diana, if you lived in the 19th century, you'd have 8 children in one book."
Instead.
It's just the opposite, and now it's 10. Now it's 10 books.
There you go.
So it's an amazing, amazing life. And thank you for reading, because without people who care about the words that authors put in the world, we wouldn't have the ability to write more books. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the great gifts of parish ministry is to be able to bring these to folks that maybe wouldn't otherwise know, right? Because how many times have I had parishioners say, well, I go into the religious section over at chapters, but I don't know what to buy.
Yeah.
So it's good that we're able to have communities to share these things with. So it's a great gift to us.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, Kevin's going to give you more of a formal introduction. You're coming up in a minute, Diana, but what we usually like to do is just do a quick check-in before we start the show. And then we have something special with Ian that we do as well. So quick check-in, anything to get us up to date with, Kevin? I know we did want to mention a very special event coming up Sunday that's part of the Vickers Crossing as well.
Yeah, so Sunday night, we're proud to host on our YouTube channel Many Faiths, One Voice, interfaith prayers for the Forest City. We've got people from across many traditions coming together, faith leaders across our city, Hindu, Sikh, the First Nations, our Baha'i community, our Muslim community, our Jewish community, our Christian community, all kinds of faith leaders. And we are encouraging people to be on our YouTube channel at 7:30 p.m. It'll go live on Sunday night, and to join in a interfaith prayer for healing, for unity, and for hope for our city in the midst of these COVID times, and all who are working so hard to get us through it.
Yeah, perfect thing for Pentecost Sunday, I think.
It is.
Bringing all those voices together, as it were, and being able to celebrate that. Good. And everything good with you, Ian?
Yeah, today, the 26th of May, is my older brother's birthday. He's turning 21, so happy birthday to him.
Happy birthday, Andrew.
Yeah.
Good. Well, happy birthday. What did you get him?
Well, here's the thing. I'll just leave it at that. I'll let your imagination take it from there.
Ian's got to go to the gas station when we're done. Great, good. Well, it's time for our favorite segment here on the Vickers Crossing podcast, which is an opportunity to get into Ian's head a little bit and find out what he thinks about things. Diana, we always get emails and people send us stuff to ask questions, but they're always for Ian. So we have this special segment that we like to call. Are you ready, Ian?
Yes.
Or ask Ian anything.
Ooh.
Ask Ian anything. So today we have a question from London, Ontario, I believe.
That's right. We have actually, Ian, if you go outside and walk just a couple blocks, this question comes from Byron out in your neighborhood.
Big area.
It
Huge
is.
area.
Yeah. So one of our listeners, Vicki Anderson, has a question for you today. She wants to know, what was the best part of your music and industry arts program at Fanshawe this year? And it certainly wasn't the COVID thing.
Wow. Where do I begin? That program is incredible for me personally. Like, I loved every part of that program. The people there, the teachers, the what you do, it was just amazing. I was so pumped to be in this program. Like, I got my work done months before it was due because I was just like, I get to do this cool thing.
You disappoint me.
No, it was just amazing. Like Dan, the coordinator, has done a really good job creating this program where it's all about the creation and behind the scenes of music. I love just the collaboration of it, and I wouldn't be able to name one thing that I liked about the program, but it was just, yeah, it sucks that COVID just chopped it off.
This is the Grammy Award nominated Dan, the director of your program.
Yes. Grammy Award nominated, Juno winning, Dan Broadback, legendary.
Shout out
person,
to the man.
The man, the myth, the legend.
Well, that's good. And Dan, if you haven't figured it out yet, Ian's a musician, and he's been hinting that there's some new music coming out too for us.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, looking forward to that. All right, Kevin, would you give a formal introduction to our guest today?
I would be happy to. And as you said earlier, we're just overly thrilled. Rob and I we're fortunate to come from a generation of clergy who've been around for this period of your writing, Diana, because it means we've been able to consume and be formed really by the inspirational work that you've done. Diana holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke. And as has been noted, she's the award-winning author of 10 books. Some you've heard mentioned here: Grounded, Finding God in the World, A Spiritual Revolution, Christianity After Religion, The End of Church and the Birth of a New Spiritual Awakening, Christianity for the Rest of Us, How the Neighborhood Church is Transforming the Faith, and Grateful, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks, which was released 2 years ago now, I guess. Mm-hmm. You'll find Diana regularly speaking when there's not COVID all over the place, but she is speaking from that room that she's in right now, is what I think is best. She says it was her writing room, now it's her studio. But you'll see her consulting with religious organizations, leading educational events, teaching preachers in a variety of venues when she's allowed to. You'll also find her in the Washington Post, the New York Times Syndicate, and the Huffington Post, and she's commented widely on religion, politics, and culture in media like USA Today, Time, Newsweek, CBS, CNN, Fox, PBS, NPR, SiriusXM, and our favorite, the CBC.
I love the CBC.
And Diana is a recipient of numerous grants and awards, and I can list them all for you, but you can look it up on our webpage, which is dianabutlerbass.com. What we know is we had the opportunity to meet with Diana in Niagara Falls as a part of our annual Bishops Clergy Conference that we go to, and it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. But we were all very excited to get down there that year because you were speaking, and you were not just a great speaker, but great company. And we're glad to have you on here. It was a dream. My wife asked me a while back, Catherine Ann, do you think you could get Diana Butler Bass? And so I can send a note. And so we're really thrilled that you've agreed to be here. Welcome.
Well, I love the title, The Vicar's Crossing. It kind of brings up images of George Herbert walking through fields.
Yeah. That's good. Well, when it started, it was
over our time. Yeah, that's for sure.
That's right. When it started, Rob and I were sitting at a pub having a beer and talking about the intersectionality of all these things that we constantly, because obviously reading your sort of stuff, we're always having these sorts of conversations. And I just floated the idea of a podcast that talked about how we might do that. And so we actually did it at the pub in an upper room, beers and the whole thing. But it took a lot of cart and equipment around. And then COVID, we moved into the office here a while back, and then COVID has sort of demanded that we move into a different format. So, but we really do like to talk about, as you say, what George Herbert writes about, that business of being in the public space, in the public domain. So let's just jump right into the good stuff, because, man, you have stirred up a bee's nest. And I'm not sure that you would have predicted a few weeks back when you sat down to write what you did, but that hornet's nest in the Anglican circles of writing about virtual communion. So let's lay out for our listeners how we got to this current fever. At the beginning of this month, you wrote for an article for Church Anew, which, by the way, if I can say, if those of you are not familiar with Church Anew, look it up, go online, excellent blogs from incredible people like Diana, Stanley Harwas, many others, Rob Bell.
The blog itself, for those of you who know him, the blog is sort of a project of Walter Brueggemann.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, he's very instrumental in thinking of this whole project of Church Anew and running it through a congregation in Minnesota. So it's kind of one of his retirement projects, if you can call it. So thank you for pointing that out. It is a really nice blog, and it's just really starting to gain a lot of traction. Yeah, partly because we created a big controversy.
Yeah, right. Good for you for stirring up on that. That's a good job, Diana. So you write about a conversation in that piece that you had with Phyllis Tickle years ago, another incredible author, another incredible person. We miss her. And like so many other aspects in her life, Phyllis had foresight to know sort of what was coming. She always was a little bit ahead of it. And she sort of saw the internet and the technology that we're using as something that would change how we see community and how we see church. She said to you, the first time a priest or bishop offers the Eucharist online, it will be like Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door. Well, if we weren't sure, just suggesting it seems to have caused a stir. So you then go on in the article to write, and you say, I've worried that in withholding communion, the church has been in effect hoarding the bread and wine, restraining the healing beauty of the Eucharist, when hungry people most need it to feast. A forced fast is no fast. It is an expression of institutional power over and against God's people in a time of emergency. And I can't help but think the lack of theological imagination at this moment will give people already wary of church another reason to consign Christianity to historical irrelevance. The pandemic, however, has been a sort of Pandora's box for churches and technology, letting loose the theological questions that Phyllis Tickle once predicted with fierce urgency of suffering and death. The lid is open and it can't be shut. Sadly, some denominations seem incapable of seeing this as a gift and possibility, preferring instead to give in to controlling impulses and fear. And holy crap, I'll admit that when I read the piece on Church Anew, I thought, well, now that's going to provoke some interesting conversation. I have mixed feelings about it myself, but I thought we'd see some really good theological dialogue.
Dialogue, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. But instead, I have to say, while there's circles in which meaningful dialogue has come out of this, like here, I hope, I could not have predicted, and I'm sure you could not, the visceral reaction, and largely on social media, some of it quite nasty, and largely from clerics. So would you mind sharing with our listeners at the outset then a little bit about, set the stage for what this was about, why it's important to you, but then also give us some sense of what you've experienced in the wake of this? Because, I mean, I like to say I'm no longer shocked by what I see in the church, but I find these things very disappointing when they happen. So if you wouldn't mind laying that out for us.
Oh, it's a really funny thing. I'm trained in history, and one of the stories I always love about Karl Barth is how when he started to put out the work he was doing on Romans, that he just thought he was doing academic work. And I remember one time hearing it described as when his work on Romans began to make its way in the larger world, it was as if he had been stumbling through the dark and reached out to grab something to hold on to when he stumbled. Instead of touching a wall, he wound up pulling the church bell, and it woke up the whole town. And there is no way that I'm likening my work to Karl Barth's, but basically that's how I feel about what happened. Is that this new blog, Church Anew, contacted me when they saw a poem that I had posted on my Facebook page. And the poem was it is actually in that blog. It's what ends the blog. It's this beautiful poem of longing for the Eucharist to flow free into the world, that the blood and the body of Christ could break forth from, as it were, the tomb and just be where it needed to be in the world. And I can never say who wrote the poem because I'm sworn to never say that, but I can tell you it was a priest.
Yeah. And
the priest was terrified to publish the poem anywhere and asked me if I could publish it. And so the Church Anew people saw the poem. They asked me if I could publish the poem with permission of my friend and then write a little introduction to it. And so I was thinking, sure, I'm happy to do that. And I was even more happy because they said, oh, by the way, we'll pay you. And I haven't been paid so long. I don't even remember what a paycheck looked like. And so people don't think about this, but I'm a freelancer. And as you were saying, my whole income, it comes from royalties from books, which I get a royalty check twice a year. And it also comes from doing events. Yeah. And so right now there are no events, and the royalty stream isn't, it's, besides books, nobody gets rich on books unless you're John Grisham or some really famous writer. Yeah. And so, anyway, we're kind of in a bad place, in my family. My husband works in a church and I don't have a paycheck. So anyway, I said to the people at Church Anew, okay, I don't really feel like I want to get into this because I think people are going to get kind of hot under the collar about it. But we talked about it a little bit. So I decided to write this story, which I thought would be relatively benign, about Phyllis Tickle, because she taught in the last couple years of her life. So that's how it came about, is that there was a beautiful poem that a friend of mine who was a priest wrote. The priest was terrified to share the poem. And so I created a platform with a frame around it so that the poem could make its way out into the world. It doesn't seem like anybody read the poem, but that everybody misread the title of what I wrote. And so anyway, the paragraph that you pull out, I'm actually really quite proud of that paragraph. I
pulled it out.
Yeah, it's clear. It's pointed, and it gets out things that I do care about. And that is this idea of restraint or leaning on the rules right now that some religious organizations seem to be so committed to, feels utterly at odds with this moment across the world where we've seen how business as usual has failed so terribly. Mm-hmm. And so what my passion was to remind people that we hold in our community this wonderful, amazing healing gift, and to see that gift withheld at the moment when it seems like it's most needed is actually painful to me. I don't think it's just painful to me as a layperson. I actually think that priests are in pain. Yeah. And I think that's part of the conversation that's been missing, is that the church is pulling out this sort of rule and saying, you must obey your vows at this moment, has restrained, I think, clergy creativity, which I have a great deal of respect for, in trying to figure out how to pastorally touch the communities in which they're located. And so I think that some of the anxiety, at least, is coming from that sense that I think a lot of clergy feel sort of buckled down at a moment when they're trying to figure out how does a church serve the world while the church is functionally in quarantine. Right. And so I just think there's a lot of pain around it, and that's what I wrote. And I'm sorry people don't like the word hoarding. It's kind of a good old-fashioned English word.
Yes.
Didn't come with malice attached to it. It was a descriptor. Shows the power of the language, if nothing else.
You've had some pretty visceral response.
Oh my gosh, yes. Literally, I was not surprised that it would attract attention. I mean, I know that I'm a decent writer, and I know that it's a subject that matters. Yeah. But I didn't expect to be called names and treated as really being less than human. Yeah. And people thinking that I had treated them as less than human and taking it as an attack on the clergy, which is astonishing to me. Something I would never do in a kind of a million years.
Right. I want to pick that up a little bit if we can, just because, and I forwarded to you a piece that came out of the Anglican Journal here, Chris Britton, I think. And the one thing that you highlighted, and you went on to comment on that blog, on that page, is just that it seems as though clerics feel that they're under attack. And there's two strains of this I want to explore, I guess. Is one of them is, it's interesting to me that the poem, which I did read and I thought was quite profound, was written by a cleric who is afraid to say that she or he wrote this. And now we've got clerics who opposed to it or whatever, for whatever reason. Their response really seems to be born out of some sort of fear that they're under attack by your words. The question I guess I have is, what does it say about us? Like, what does it say about us as a church if we've got a priest who can pour out those beautiful words, and that priest is fearful to make themselves public? And what does it say about us if, whenever we have a theological disagreement, we go to the lowest base? We've been so influenced by the American politic, for instance, that we reduced to name calling now. Is that?
Well, I have sort of two thoughts. One is my priest friend feels miserable because they shared this beautiful piece with me and willingly allowed it to go out into the world through, my reputation, and feels like, oh my gosh, they do feel bad, but they also feel like they were sort of right.
Rightly worried, clearly.
Correct. Yeah. Because they would not have been in a very good place had those words gone out otherwise. So there was no need for my friend to apologize, because it's a beautiful, amazing poem, and it really illustrated what I felt too. So so that was just one thing. The other piece is, where is this coming from? You know, one thing I don't want to say, which I think is really tempting, is to say, well, this, you know, shows the Trumpization of the American Episcopal Church or what have you, because, you know, that kind of seems like that would seem like name calling, I think, on my part,
Right.
to say that people who disagreed, and even people who have been really mean about it, were just like Donald Trump, you know, and they're not. And, you know, although I think there's a certain freedom or permission giving that's happened particularly on the internet, because of this moment we live in, you know, makes people act poorly, including myself sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, I don't really think that's the deepest reason. A place that you all probably don't know, is that the first book I ever wrote was under my previously married name, just under Diana Butler. It was my dissertation, and it was published in 1994, 96, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember. By Oxford University Press. I think it was 96. And that book was a history of the Evangelical Party in the American Episcopal Church in the 19th century. And there's this very interesting deep history that not many people know. And the short version of it is this. In the early period after the United States broke away from England, you know, the Anglican tradition had a huge problem. And that is the problem of, how can you be Anglicans if you hate the Church of England? You know, if you just led a revolution against it, you know, so it's like, it was really difficult for people to figure out. And one of the ways that the Episcopal Church adjusted in the early republic of the early American Republic is that it sort of buddied up to American evangelicalism, from about 1800 to about 1830. And so the Episcopal Church had higher church elements, but it mostly resembled Presbyterianism with ministers who wore fancier clothes. And so there were, as a matter of fact, most early priests in the Episcopal Church went to Princeton. And so they were very close to the Reformed tradition and very evangelical in their outlook, and just sort of higher church in terms of liturgy and celebration of Christmas and the way their churches looked and all these other things. Well, that whole sort of evangelical phase of the Episcopal Church in the United States caused a backlash to happen in the 1840s and 1850s, where a lot of people began to reject evangelicalism and went in a very sort of romantic direction. It was much higher church, and it emphasized issues of authority, of clerical order, of control, really, over and against the rambunctiousness of American evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church went from this sort of open-ended, very Protestant phase to this much more orderly, sort of hierarchical phase of being concerned with sort of the history of the Middle Ages and all these kinds of things. So it went from a kind of chaotic Anglicanism towards a very, very orderly form of Anglicanism. And this shift from prophetic sort of populism towards orderly authoritarianism based in Anglican practice was a very profound shift in the history of the Episcopal Church. And I actually think that's what's happening right now. I think that the Episcopal Church has been through a long period of time, basically the last 30 or 40 years, when it was very influenced by things like the charismatic movement, by new forms of populism, some of them progressive, some of them more evangelical, lots of sort of congregational sorts of power, a willingness to break rules in the ordination of women and then the ordination of gay and lesbian persons, and pushing through same-sex marriage in the United States and, of course, in Canada as well. And that whole sort of phase of breaking rules in order to accomplish something, of putting power back in the hands of people and congregations, of celebrating congregational autonomy, of a kind of freedom of worship and expression, is now giving way to the opposite.
Right.
It just exactly like it did in the 19th century. And, why should I be surprised? And I think that's what I'm kind of caught in the crosshairs of.
Right.
Of that historical shift.
You just painted that picture. I can see it now, that complete shift. And
Yeah.
like, out of that often comes pain, right? And fear and not knowing, and people lash out as they have.
That's right. It's a reminder that clericalism is alive and well, right? Like it's.
Yeah, that's been kind of sad to me, and again, I don't generally like to use the isms, or I really have done everything in my power in the last 4 years to restrain myself from name calling. I haven't always succeeded.
Yeah.
But
Although.
but I have really tried to live out of a different kind of space, especially on social media. But there is a kind of, what I would say is a rebirth of a desire for orderliness.
Yes.
And that part of that order is a hierarchically arranged authority.
Right.
And if one wants to refer to that as clericalism, that's historically one of the names it's gone by.
Yeah, and there are those that I remember. The metaphor I'm thinking of is going out on a boat ride with my brother, and I like the boat to be really bumpy and bounce us all over, and my brother would scream, "Just go slow, like put it in first gear and let's just orderly, chug along here." And you get both in the same boat, you're going to have these types of things that happen, and that's where we are right now. A lot of different
That's
ways.
a great illustration. Oh my gosh, it's a great illustration.
Put it in your book.
I'm sure it will get me in trouble.
Consider it payment from the Vickers Crossing for you. Great.
Right. Good.
But isn't it interesting? I mean, I think that part, for me at least, one of the things it has shown is there has been a terrible decline in the teaching the history of, at least in the United States, teaching the history of the Episcopal Church in this cultural context. One of the things that, and I don't know if this is true in Canada or Australia as well, but I'm very good friends with the dean and president of Virginia Theological Seminary. I really like him. We go out when we can, before the pandemic. We go out together. I'm friends with his family. His son and my daughter were in the same youth group in church and all this sort of stuff. But it is profoundly sort of troubling to me that of the major denominational seminaries in our country, is that 2 of them are headed by people who aren't from the United States.
Right.
Ooh. Wow.
That's right.
And that, when I talk to Ian, who I really am friends with, he's now an American citizen.
Yeah.
So, he knows a lot, and he's a really smart guy. But there is no American religious history class taught at Virginia Seminary anymore. And there's no history of the American Episcopal Church taught at Virginia Seminary anymore. There's kind of history of Anglicanism, and there's history of Christianity.
Right.
But
that's what I remember in seminary. It was about kings and stuff from the 1300s. That was Christian history, right? It wasn't been the last 100 years.
And most of what I can see is being taught right now is not that deeply contextualized history because if nothing else, the American Episcopal Church is weird. It's very different. You know, it's one of the first. It's really the first form of Anglicanism that emerged by cutting up the Book of Common Prayer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, really, I keep looking at this stuff and people saying, "Oh, obey the rubrics, obey the rubrics." There would be no Episcopal Church if people 250, 300 years ago had obeyed the rubrics,
Yeah.
because the first people in the Episcopal Church literally took scissors and cut out entire sections of the Book of Common Prayer that they'd inherited from the Church of England in order to be an American Episcopal Church.
They didn't want to. They didn't want to be praising kings.
That's right. They cut those prayers out, and so it's like those rubrics were gone. Those prayers were gone, and that was part of the problem. And so it's really interesting to me that there's this moment, and have been moments as well in the 19th century, when all of a sudden the American church looks more like the highest church version of British Anglicanism that one could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
Then it looks like its own very rebellious root.
Well, speaking of kings, Rob.
Speaking of kings, yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about the context in which you live in right now in the U.S. and over the last few years, because it is, as we've said, being in that context is bringing about a lot of what we're seeing now in the church and in culture. Your writing and your works have always been very progressive and hopeful as well. And I wanted to reference something that came out of one of your latest books, Grateful, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks. You wrote that book a few years ago now, I think. And if I remember, as I read it when it came out, you were talking about when Donald Trump came into the presidency. It was around that same time that you were putting this book together. And in April of 2018, in an op-ed in the New York Times, you addressed the obsession that Trump has with being thanked, speaking of gratefulness. And you wrote this, Mr. Trump's obsession with gratitude is a regular feature of his unscripted remarks and speeches. When people thank him, he likes them, but when slighted, he is quick to criticize unappreciative offenders. He has attacked Puerto Rican leaders as politically motivated ingrates, demanded public thanks from his cabinet and members of Congress, wants people to thank him for stock market gains, and so on. And then you go on to say, gratitude is central to Mr. Trump's politics. He demands it of his followers, his cabinet, and indeed of all citizens. He deploys gratitude against his enemies and critics to embarrass and shame. Being grateful is not an option, it is a requirement. And Donald Trump has made thank you divisive. And so, as I say, in that context that you're living in right now, and your work is very progressive and hopeful, what has it been like, and has it been difficult to be hopeful and a hopeful voice in a way for America in these times? And what have been some of the challenges for you in your writings and your speaking over the last couple of years?
Oh, I just want you to know that one of the things that got edited out of that New York Times piece was he once demanded gratitude from the entire nation of Canada. Because he did something or other that would allow the Keystone Pipeline to go through. And so he was very offended.
For which about 2/3 of us are not grateful.
Well, he was very offended that none of them said thank you. And so there was this whole riff one time on Twitter about how the Canadians were so rude that none of them had said thank you. So,
and now it's the governors, right? Now it's the governors are not thankful.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's the
That's
governors
right.
now. Yeah, you're not grateful. You're not thankful, so you're not getting PPE, things that are helping to save people's lives, support our frontline.
right. And the smart ones, of course, figured out that they needed to say thank you.
Yeah.
And so like Cuomo of New York or Newsom of California, big states where they needed some real help and big outbreaks. Both of those governors basically did. They sort of went to Trump. Cuomo in person, I don't think Newsom's left California, but they did obeisance. I mean, literally.
Yeah, it really did.
They literally went and said, thank you, like he is a medieval potentate, sitting on a throne. And but I don't like calling anyone names.
I know, but once in a while we have to indulge ourselves, Diana, please.
Well, that's a literary description, not name calling. So they went and they did that, and then they got what they wanted. And now what the interesting thing is you probably haven't seen this, but Trump is producing commercials for his reelection, and within them are clips of Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo saying, thank you.
Yeah.
You did what we asked you to do. We really appreciate it. And so that's part of this whole, we're just tied up in this mess where if you don't say, thank you, if you don't give him appreciation for his authority and his power and his largesse, you don't get what you need. And then if you do, you look like, he uses you. Yeah. It's just so horrible.
So fair to say he hasn't read your book. not really getting the gist of what you were talking about. Yeah.
You expect him to read a book?
Yeah. But how do you stay hopeful and moving all through this, because this is your writing, this is your voice, and you're in this context that nobody would have imagined it would be like this. How do you continue with that?
I really appreciate that, Rob. The bigger question is actually part of the reason why I stay hopeful, and it's tied into what we were just talking about. In the same way that I think Anglicanism globally is actually going through a shift away from sort of local expressions and populism and sort of a more empowered congregational sense towards a reassertion of authority. And I think we saw that through the whole thing about gay and lesbian ordination and same-sex marriage. And, in a global scale, there's been this, sort of desire to create doctrinal commissions that would have authority over all the local churches. And so I know that the Anglican Church of Canada has had some pretty strong things to say about that. That's not who we really are. And certainly the American Church has done the same, and the New Zealanders have backed off of that. But yet there are certain parts of Anglicanism that want this hierarchical, sort of strengthened structure put in place as a way of solving our problems and keeping people in order. Okay, so that was the Anglican conversation. And the way it's working out in the United States, right now is focused on this whole issue of virtual communion and calling me names. But that's a symptom of a global moment. What we're going through in Anglicanism is just a symptom of a larger struggle. And this is what I wrote about in Christianity After Religion, and I've preached about this everywhere, is that there are two very large contending visions right now of what it means to be human and in community. And the one image of that, I think Kevin just described so beautifully when he was talking about the service for prayer for Pentecost. And the image is that of a table, is that the human community is trying to figure out what does it mean to be a global table of hospitality, of being able to pull up chairs, of passing the gifts and provisions of God and the universe around, making sure that everyone is fed and everyone is safe and that everyone has a space and that the table is not being controlled by any one group, but instead the conversation is open for all to join. And so there are political and social movements all over the world and people all over this planet whose hearts are working towards that table. And it's happening in different ways, in different religious traditions, in different political traditions. And yet there's this vision of a true global table. of humankind. And the reasons for the construction of that table, the reason for opening that table up, is we know that the problems that we are facing as human beings are so extraordinary that we have to have one another to survive as a species, and to be able to pass the gifts of creation on to our children and grandchildren. So that's one vision. The other vision is all of the problems we have come because the structures of authority, the roles of authority have broken down. And so what we need is sort of to fix the pyramids of power that have been in place over time and make them function better. So instead of a table, they lean towards this idea of the hierarchical structures that we already have. Now, some people who are in favor of these hierarchical structures just see them as somewhat damaged and need to be tweaked so that they would work. And so I have fairly good friends who are religious leaders who are involved in, say, Davos. And people at Davos are people. And by and large, I think that the problems that people bring up at Davos, they see as problems of this structure not being quite fair enough, or not being able to distribute its goods widely enough towards the people at the bottom of the structure. And so they want to tinker with the structure. They want to fix it, make it more just. So they invite all kinds of interesting people to come to Davos, or philosophers, or religious leaders, or economists with fairer visions of what our life together could be. But they never question the pyramid. And then when few people do, like a Dutch economist did a couple years ago, those people are then not reinvited.
Extricated.
Yeah. But then you have people who also believe in this pyramid, who are more like Donald Trump, or more like, the Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Putin in Russia. And they think that the problem is not that it's not fit, it just needs tweaking. They actually think the pyramid needs to be completely rebuilt.
Yeah.
Right.
And that what it needs to do is it needs to be strengthened. It needs to be made. It needs to make sure that the right people have the power they deserve. And that if the right people have the power they deserve, well, then the pyramid will work. And so, the other week, Trump, they let him out of the White House, and he went to Michigan, which is not very far away from where you all live. Yeah. And he gave a speech at the Ford plant, and he talked about bloodlines.
Yeah.
I read that. Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah, he talked about Henry Ford having the right bloodlines.
Yeah.
And so, if anything, what that is that's this illustration, is that there are people who deserve, by race, by birth, by their gene pool, to be at the top of this pyramid. And the problem with the pyramid is that the wrong people were sort of getting up towards the top of it.
Yeah.
And so what has to happen politically is those people had to be cast out. They had to be put in their proper places. The poor, people who are brown, people who are black, people who aren't Christians, people who have the wrong blood.
Yeah. Wow.
And once those people are put back in place, then everything will be fixed. Mm. And so there's this quest, there's a fight on a global scale between the feasting of a wide open table,
right,
and the rebuilding of a firm structure of authority, whether by tweaking or whether by asserting a new power for that authority. And that's being reflected in our politics and in our religion. Now, what keeps me hopeful is that there's a fight.
Well, that's true. I mean, we had Matthew Koenig on here a couple of weeks back. I don't know if you've seen this book of his.
I love that book.
Yeah.
That's a great book.
It is a great book. And he uses that image as well of a well-laid table, right? Yeah. Of wanting to make sure that we don't just welcome people. That, It's one thing to take down the walls, or to not begin to talk about building them at all, but that when we live that fullness of a theology of hospitality, that what we're extending is a well-laid table, a feast. So I love the image. That's all I was following up. Ian, you probably wanted to get onto some creativity, did you?
Sorry?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, Ian, yeah.
Yeah.
Ian has
So
questions for you.
yes, I do. I wanted to head back to your book, Grounded. And you write about creativity. Let me just read this here. You write, awe is the gateway to compassion. It is a deep awareness that we are creators who work with the creator in an ongoing project of crafting a world. If we do not like the world or are afraid of it, we have a hand in that. And if we make a mess, we clean it up and can do better. And do better, sorry. We are what we make. Now, I wanted to know what the background of that quote was, and why specifically you wrote about creativity in your book, and why creativity is important to you in a time of like you said, sort of a fight against structure, I guess.
There are certain themes that show up, I think, over and over and over again in my work: compassion, the table, creativity. They all show up. For me, when I wrote Grounded, one of the things that I really wanted to do in that book was to put out the best writing that I'd done ever in my life. It's actually, Grounded is really my favorite book that I ever wrote, although you're not supposed to have favorites. It's like children, you're not supposed to have favorites. And so I worked so hard with that book to lift my own voice as a writer to a place that it hadn't been before. So I had just been through a really deep, moving, creative process that I think changed me a lot as a person. And so that's really kind of my own experience, was going into that. And, this whole conversation seems to me to tie together in the point of creativity, is because when it comes to the Eucharist, one of the things I was urging in the writing I was doing about that was, hey, this is a time to be creative, not just to lean back on the rules, but to say the rules kind of aren't working right now. So where can our imaginations take us? The project of setting a global table for the future of the planet that would involve saving essentially the gifts of creation for the future, for saving the human race. If nothing else, that is a massively creative project. We have to have our best selves at that table, with our imaginations wide open, and our ability to live together, which we've never done before. We've usually killed one another when we tried to gather at tables together. And so we're going to have to be really creative in thinking about how this kind of community is formed. And I actually think that the creative piece is what makes sometimes these things very hard, is because when people are stressed, it is harder to get there. I've been working on a new book all during this pandemic, and it's really hard to be creative in a moment when you feel like, I don't know what the future holds. But yet, to me, it seems like creativity is at the heart of who God is. You open the pages of Genesis, and in the beginning is God. And the word love doesn't actually appear in the first several chapters of Genesis, but the word create does. And so when we think about the primal of Israel, which we get in those first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's really all about creation, and also then about sin. Sin is not a lack of love in the primal history of Israel. Sin is a violation against creation. And so we get this incredible primal story that opens up about God's creativity. Creativity is God, as it were. And that human beings are invited into the extension of that creativity by God saying, here is all of what I've created. Now I want you to have mastery over it. And we sometimes think of mastery as that pyramid of control. But what mastery is if you're, I mean, Ian, you're a musician, I'm a writer, we know this. What mastery is giving oneself over to the life of a craft. And the craft it has rules, as it were. You know, there's standards and ways that it's been applied in the past and all that. But what we know is that mastery ultimately is a kind of imaginative freedom that propels us into the deepest places of creativity beyond what we can even imagine when we start the path of mastery. And so when Genesis, God says to the humans that have been created, and here you are, take all of this stuff and have mastery in creation. And that's, I think, what God is inviting us to. The crafting, the creative process of what it means to nurture and seed a world and to make it productive, to make it prosper, to make it flourish, to make the forests beautiful and the fields to grow and the animal life to be happy. And that's what we're invited to do. It's not dominion over in this sense. It's the mastery of that creative invitation that God puts humanity in that garden to do. And then that's what we turn our back on, you know, and in a sense, the opposite of creativity becomes murder.
Violence.
Murder, violence, yeah, exclusion, yeah, these types of things.
Yeah.
I think it's
and I mean, it's, for me, oh man, it's so great to be here and just be able to say some of these things, because the last 4, 5, 6 years for me have been, I have read scripture more. You asked me what gives me hope. I've read scripture more than I ever have. And what I have begun to see those stories with eyes that I never imagined.
right.
And a big part of it was writing the book Grounded and letting myself just flow into that space of imagination and say to myself, every time I open the pages of the Bible, my question is, what have I not seen here before?
Right. I think Rob, I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but like for me, I just think of Ian and his songwriting and everything else that he does, quite frankly, and that generation and some of the incredible creativity that's coming out of there. And then what I was going to say is for people like Rob and I, we've also been the benefactors of you know, your work to master the you know, your craft of writing. I look to people like yourselves, like you, Andy, and I'd put you in the same category in a different way.
Sweet, high five.
High five.
I love it.
Because I guess what I'm getting at is that it's people who are giving birth to imagination.
Yeah.
And when you talk about that pyramid, you know, I think that just lacks any imagination. But the imaginative idea of a you know, as Miroslav Volf talks about flourishing in this way, that this idea of everybody being able to dine and feast at this table. You know, to me, it's a very Julia Child's image. You know, ooh, give it more butter.
Try this.
Yeah, ooh, it's delightful. And it's just, to me, it's the incredible place we're able to go when folks like Ian and Diana are able to engage their imagination and then pour out words that break open something new. And that's really where we need to go. Rob, you must, like, you've seen that.
Well, I was thinking of it in another context too, and this is the grace and blessing we have as preachers, that
Yes.
that creativity that we can bring to our parish every week, through those words, and to create like that, and to also know that the mastery of that also means this, and this is part of the quote in Diana's book about, you know, that we can make that mess,
Yes.
even with our own parishes in that creativity.
Yeah.
And we do, as preachers, hit ourselves over the head afterwards and say, oh, why did I do it that way? But then you have people coming to you and saying, wow, I never thought about it that way before. That really moved me. And even out of that mess, that creativity created something for them and some form of new life or understanding. So, you know, that's a gift in the context that I live in anyway, as a parish priest, that creativity in that sense is is powerful for me.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rob. I had never thought of it that way, but that's true. It's that mastery of homiletics too, right? So sometimes you and I both know, and I'm sure that writers and songwriters the same thing. People come to you after a homily and say, this changed me because of this, and you look at it and go, really?
Oh yeah, I always think I preached a real.
I'm really glad.
A mess. That's a complete mess. When they say, "Thank you, Father,"
I'm thrilled. I had a phone call one time from a woman that said, "I just want to let you know, I just signed up." This was when I was in Tecumseh. I just signed up for a trip to Haiti. She's a retired nurse. I'm going to go down there for 10 days because of your sermon on Sunday. And I spent 3 days scratching my head trying to figure out what the heck the Spirit was saying.
Yeah.
That motivated that, and then I realized, why am I trying to do this? It doesn't matter what I don't need to interpret that. It's what that creative energy produces, right? So
and it is from God.
That's right.
You got to give that over, right?
Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a really interesting thing sort of floating around. My sister-in-law, she's a doctor. I mean, not only a doctor, she was the president of the American College of Surgeons.
Oh, she's a real doctor.
She's incredible, and she was proposing for medical
extreme.
Yeah, really. Believe me, if you're sick, you want to go see her. But she was floating around this idea about the training of doctors being like the guild model, of apprentice and then novice, and or what is it, novice, apprentice, and then craftsperson and master, or whatever that stage thing. And I remember when she was talking about it, it really made me think about, there's a wisdom in that medieval practice. Yeah. And I think it's often been misinterpreted as being hierarchical, where you rise to be a master. Because we always think, in Western culture, we're always thinking of hierarchies and pyramids. Right. And so we think that the best is at the top, the worst is at the bottom, and we get messed up on that. But really what happens is a guild is a circle. It met in a guild hall around drinking. And,
we're back to the bar again.
Right, back to the bar. And what you do is you learn a craft side by side with people. Yeah. And so the creative process takes place. And so when a person is in the very first stages of that craft, there are a lot of rules. Yeah. But the further you go along, the fewer rules there are, because you've internalized the standards of the craft. And once you've internalized the standards of the craft, then you let go. And that's, to me, also theology really needs to be like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, it's just it's interesting to me that there's a kind of a medieval longing floating around the church right now. But the truth of it is that in the Middle Ages, even with all of their hierarchicalism and all of their great chain of being and all this kind of stuff, there were these violations of that were all the ideas of pilgrimage broke hierarchy. Right. The ideas of the guilds actually broke hierarchy, despite that they used the language of hierarchy to sort of disguise it. Yeah. The language of poetry and romantic love broke hierarchy, and so that whole tradition busted through hierarchy. So there are all kinds of beautiful and wonderful models of this that come from our own history that we can employ at this moment. And so to say that we are striving towards this creative vision, or that's the primary understanding of God, is not to say that is outside of the tradition. That's actually within the tradition. It's just parts of the tradition we've ignored. And so anyway, these are things that, I think about. And I think for me, where we started this, you sort of asking me with the kind of the goofy blow up about virtual communion. I think one of the hardest things for me has been to hear people say that I wasn't Anglican enough. I literally, that's just sort of shocking to me, because I understand, and they say, you're not keeping your vows. Well, one, I'm a layperson, so I'm not quite sure what kind of vows I'm supposed to be keeping.
Marriage?
But yeah, my marriage vows, it's like my baptism vows, I do my best. But see, the idea of what a vow is kind of strange there.
Yeah.
You know, it's like there's this written set of rules that you have to hold on to, and if you ever move beyond that, you're somehow violating it. When my sense of Anglicanism has always been that it's a life of avowal.
It's how we busted out.
well, yes. See, to me, the idea, I have vows. I live in a way that is, I think, I live in relationship to a promise.
Right.
And that promise is that God is fully embodied in the world.
Right.
And that's what I live in and with. And that for me in Anglicanism, that avowal of the presence of God in and through the world in Anglicanism has always been better expressed by our poets, our painters, our musicians, our architects, our farmers, and our families sitting around table doing family prayer together.
Yeah.
Than it has been. You don't really think of Anglicanism as a strictly doctrinal kind of tradition or a legal tradition in the same way. You know, I don't think Anglicanism and canon law. You know, I think Anglicanism and T.S. Eliot.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And so it's in what way?
Creativity we're talking about.
Right.
All that spawns that creativity.
Right. That to me is the hope place. Right. Is that our poets are still writing poetry, that our writers are still writing prose, that our painters are still painting pictures, that our farmers are still planting seeds, that our composers are still composing, that people are still playing their musical instruments, and that life of avowal, that God is promised to be with us in all times, in all places, through our hands, through the work of art, through our imagination. If that's not Anglicanism, I don't know what is.
Amen, sister.
Amen. Yeah, that's a great message of hope. That's where it's at. And,
and so that's what I'm living.
Yeah, good for you.
I mean, Julian of Norwich, she said something like, "We're not made by God; we're made of God."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you know. God. And it's that imagination. And that's really, when you talk about, I was just thinking as you were talking about vows, what you've really been doing is living your baptismal vows very well. And that business of seeking and serving Christ in all persons, loving neighbor as self, striving for peace and unity, dignity for every human being, care to planet, grounded, my God, all of it is rooted in this profound conversation of being able to be hopeful and imaginative and to push the limits of what the structures of empire building in the world are, to push them back, because that's the work of Jesus, and that's who we're called to be.
That's right.
Yeah,
and I'm longing for that table.
Yeah,
me too.
And that is just so much about what we've tried to do in this podcast, is to talk about faith in the public square, and that's just that vision of it, isn't it? Just plant ourselves right in there in the world. So
just as a final word, as you guys are closing up, because I know we're running long, but the internet stuff has been really hard, and I've actually had people calling me up and sending me emails and texting me saying you should leave the Episcopal Church. I mean, literally people in other denominations saying they've never seen anything like it. How much invective. They said, how can you stand having the clergy in your own church saying so many horrible things about it? Really, come to the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah.
And so I've had invitations to leave by ministers in other churches, which is kind of astonishing to me. It can't vaguely, but I was in conversation with a bishop, and the bishop said to me, you know, I don't really agree with what you're saying about the Eucharist, but I'm really glad you're saying it. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, you are doing your job. Mm-hmm. And he said, thank you. Not only are you doing it, but you're doing it well.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, I hope you hold on.
That made me say, okay.
I hope you hold on to that, because it really is that image you spoke of earlier with Carl Barth ringing a bell when he reached out. We need these conversations. As I said, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I know I feel good about having the conversation because that's what we really need to be doing.
Right. And I certainly would never want to hurt any of you and the ability for you all to do your jobs, you know, because I have to do mine and you have to do yours. And somehow when we're all doing them, we're going to get to the place we need. But ultimately, the job is exactly what you all were just saying. The job is ultimately the job of Jesus to push back empire and to, you know, I always think of that story of Israel. Where the people of Israel are yelling at God, God, can you set a table in the wilderness? And the answer that comes forth from God in that amazing story is, oh, yes, I can, and watch me.
Yes.
And to me, that becomes the story of the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. And then it becomes the Jesus story. It's the story of, yes, I will set that table in the wilderness. Watch me.
Watch me go. Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. That's what our job ultimately is pushing back the table, pushing back the pyramid of empire so that the table will be set.
That's right.
Period.
Amen.
Amen. And as you continue your work and your ministry and your job around that, can you quickly just give us maybe an indication of anything new that you're working on that might be coming out that we can watch for?
Breaking news.
Breaking news?
I'm writing a book about Jesus.
Oh.
I've never written a book about Jesus. So told you I've been reading the Bible a lot.
Coming soon or?
It was supposed to come out like right before Lent next year. Everything in publishing has really slowed down. I suspect it will be during Lent or maybe at Easter. We're within about a year of about 11 months, I say, of publication. I haven't put it up yet, but there is a cover art that we've agreed to. The title is Finding Jesus. And the subtitle is, not Finding Jesus. That was one of the titles.
I was going to say the subtitle is He's Lost.
That's right. No, the title is Freeing Jesus. And then it's rediscovering Jesus as friend, teacher, savior, Lord, way, and presence.
I think of that Christ of Maryknoll image, of Jesus behind a barbed wire, freeing Jesus,
Yeah. Also, my friend who was a Methodist who put the baby Jesus behind a fence this last year to protest what's going on our southern border.
Yeah,
so.
Kids and stuff. Yeah.
You guys are great. It's a great conversation. Thank you so much.
No, we've really enjoyed having you. Would you indulge us just for 30 seconds? We like to do this with all our guests just to wrap up. This is the lightning round. Just a few quick questions. Okay. Whatever comes off the top of your head. And there's bonus points if we get to the sixth one. So first question in the lightning round for you, Diana. Locked in your house with all this isolation going on, what's Diana's go-to comfort food?
Chocolate chip cookies.
Nice.
Last show you binge watched?
Mrs. America.
Favorite saint?
Oh, that's mean. California.
Oh. Favorite churchy word?
Incarnation.
And churchy word we really need to put to rest.
Canon.
Perfect. I like that.
or rubric, one of the two, but both of them, as far as I'm concerned.
You weren't talking about that in like the manifest way, like if someone is that honorific title canon, like you don't want to lay me.
No. I like canons as human beings, but
I just hope if they do lay me to rest.
Them at me, I don't really like them.
I just hope if they do lay me to rest, everybody walks by and goes, "My God, he looks some good."
That's a Newfoundland thing. Yeah.
The other one would be ontologically changed.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
So if we get that, so I actually have that's more than a word. I have about a dozen words I'd like to put to rest.
Yeah, that's just a little book to put out because I'd buy that.
Yeah.
Words that I just enough are like narthex, please.
Yeah. Narthex, like somebody should have removed.
Yeah, get the whole thing out. Good. Well, Diana, hey, thanks so much. Gosh, what a thrill. What a gift you are to the church and to us today. We're so appreciative of your work and looking forward to freeing Jesus and much more. And we wish you and your family God's blessing and safety, and we hope you stay well. Okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
That's great. And thanks to our listeners for dropping in again to the Vickers Crossing. Thanks to our sponsor, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And until we get together again next time, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George, St. Aidan's.
I'm Ian.
And that's Diana. And our thanks again. And take care,
everybody.
Yeah, we'll hope to see you soon. And to our listeners, we always want to leave you with this great piece of reminder and advice. Kevin, remember, we should always look both ways
Before you cross the street.